All right, so welcome back. In the last video, we learned all sorts of neat tips and tricks on how to write formulas really, really quickly. Now what I want to do is I want to talk to you about the next step. I want to talk to you about what I call uber formulas. In other words, what is known as functions in spreadsheets, okay? And in order to explain what the usefulness of functions, I'm going to walk through a little example here of what happens when we start to do some calculations that are a little bit more complex than just these normal kind of calculations. Let's start with an easy example here. Let's say I wanted to add up this column of numbers right here, okay? So I'm just going to add a total row right here, and let's say I wanted to add up all the numbers that are within here. And if I asked you to do that, knowing what you know about formulas, what would you do? Okay, think about this. Well, if you remember, okay, the first thing you probably start with is that equal sign, and you'd be right. Yeah, you're going to write that equal sign. And then if you want to add up all of those, that's just a simple addition formula. So do you think you can do this? You can go B1, and then we'll do plus, and then B2, and we could keep going right there, and then B4. And so all we've done is we've just added extra values in there, but that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so do you think this will work? Well, let's hit the return key, and yes. Okay, so it added up that series of numbers correctly, 42. Okay, so problem solved, right? Is that pretty easy? All right. Well, what if I'd given you a list that was way bigger than this? What if I'd given you a list that had 100 rows or 1,000 rows? Would you do the same thing? Would you go click plus click plus click plus click? Yeah, that would probably not be quite so practical at that point, right? So you're thinking, okay, so maybe in this case, a formula is not such a great idea. Maybe I need a different tool, okay? Let me show you something else that happens, okay? Another problem with this is, let's say I'd forgotten to include a number in here. What if I decided I'm going to do insert row here, and let's say I wanted to add an extra number in here. Let's add the number 10 right here, okay? And if I hit return, I fully expect this to be added to this number down here, but clearly it has not. Right? And that's just because the spreadsheet didn't know that you added that extra number there, or as far as the spreadsheet's concerned, all you wanted to add up was just B1 plus B3 plus B4 plus B5. And so that's no good either. So, we see that in this case, using a formula is going to be not quite what we want, okay? It's not quite flexible enough of a solution in order to add up this entire column of numbers reliably. And so what I want to do now is I want to introduce a new tool called functions. And if the word functions is scaring you, if you've got flashbacks to high school math and you're starting to panic, please don't panic, okay? It's not going to be very hard at all. In fact, functions are just another tool to make it really, really easy for you to get answers from your information, from the numbers and from the data that is on your spreadsheet. Before we dive into a really simple function example, I want to talk to you about the syntax of functions, of writing functions. And all that means is just, this is the way we write functions. Do you remember how we went through the syntax of writing calculations, which is just equals and then something plus something, etc.? Okay, well, let's actually talk about the syntax for writing functions. To do this, I'm actually going to switch over to just a plain text editor here, or to a Word document, or a text document here, just so that we can kind of focus on just what goes into writing a function, okay? And at its heart, functions are really, really easy to write. They're very, very simple. The first thing we're going to do is, like the formulas, we're going to write the equal sign. That's the very, very first thing we need to do. Next, okay, and remember, we're not putting any spaces in here. Don't be putting spaces in here, okay? We're just, think economy, okay? What we're going to do now is we're going to type the name of the function. And the neat thing about learning these functions, and trust me, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of different functions available. You don't have to know all the names of the functions, okay? There's just going to be a handful of functions that, to begin with, you're going to use on a regular basis. But then the great thing is that once you know the names of functions, once you're familiar with those, they are, for the most part, sort of universal across spreadsheet applications or across most spreadsheet applications. Certainly any functions that you will learn about in LibreOffice, you will be able to use in Excel and vice versa. Okay, so most spreadsheet programs all use the same functions. Certainly the common functions are all exactly the same, and that is really cool. The name of the function, you're just going to type out the name of the function, and again, it can be uppercase or lowercase. For the time being, I'm just going to start by typing in uppercase. There's no function called name. I'm just typing out name as an example, okay? You write the name of the function, and then again, right away, without any space, now what you're going to do is you're going to do a bracket. You're going to open that bracket up, and then inside here, you're going to put some stuff. I'll talk a little bit about what goes inside there, and then you're going to close the bracket. That's all a function is, okay? This is really, at its core, that's all a function looks like. It's equals, and then there's the name of the function, okay? And then there's opening and closing brackets. And then you're going to put some information in here. What are you going to put inside here? Well, that depends. You could put some number values. You could put some cell values, okay? There's a number of different options in here. If you decide to, you could just put a number value like 34, okay? That's a possibility. You might put you might put a cell, like maybe B4, a cell name. Sometimes you're going to put two cell names. Maybe you'll do B4, comma, C3. Okay, you might put two cells. Or here's another example. You might want to put a cell range. Okay, and what a cell range is just an indication to the spreadsheet. I want you to apply this function to all of the cells that are between these two cells. In other words, if I put a cell range of let's start with B1, 2, okay, and look, I'm going to put a colon right here to indicate that we're writing a range to B15, then what that is this range here represents all of the cells that are located between B1 all the way up to and including B15. So there's 15 cells in there that it's including. And a function is basically, when I said applying a function, all it is it is taking whatever this function is, okay, it's going to do it to whatever's inside here, okay? So that's enough. Okay, I would just want to make sure we know the syntax. It's much easier to understand when we actually do it in practice. So let's try an example. I'm going to start by just deleting what's inside here, and we're going to write our first function. We're going to write what I think is the most commonly used function, a very, very useful function called the sum function. And all the sum function does is that it sums up whatever it is that you give it. Okay, so in this case, if we wrote sum instead of name, okay, if we wrote sum, all we're doing is we're asking the spreadsheet, hey, give me the sum, in other words, add up, all of the values that are in this range between B1 and B15. All right, is that starting to make more sense? Let's see it in action. Let's go back here and let's go ahead and start writing our first function. I'm going to go equal sign and I'm going to type sum. Okay, this time I did it in a lowercase because remember, uppercase or lowercase doesn't matter. Without any spaces, I'm going to open up my bracket. And what am I going to do here? I'm going to start with the first cell in my range. So at the very, very top here, I'll start with B1. And then I'm going to do a colon to indicate that I want a range that I want to add up. Okay, and then the very last one here is what? It is B5. So I'm going to put B5 and then I have to close the bracket. And so now I've correctly written this function. This function is saying to the spreadsheet, hey, I want you to take everything that is between B1 and B5, all the values that are inside there, and I want you to sum them up together. Okay, so let's see what happens when I hit enter. All right, it's added them up to 52, and that's correct, right? And look, we can read up here in the input line, we can see the function right up here, sum B1 to B5, and it's added all that up correctly. And do you see how handy this is? Because now, okay, now if we had a spreadsheet that was 100 lines long, 100 rows long, you wouldn't have to go click, 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 click. All you need to do is just write a function that said equals sum B1 to B100 or whatever it happens to be, or B1000 even if your spreadsheet was that long, and the spreadsheet would know to go in and add up all of the values between all of there in that entire range. So this is a really flexible tool. Okay, you start to realize how this is actually even more handy than some of these formulas. All right. Let me show you one last thing. Let's say we wanted to add yet another line. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go insert row. And let's say I decided to add 5. I'm going to add the number 5 in here. watch what happens down here. I put 5 and I hit enter, and it automatically added that. Why? Because it's smart enough to realize, oh, this is inside that range that you told me about, so you probably want to include it, okay? That's how the sum function works. Different functions that do different things will work differently. But sum, that's pretty obvious, right? You want to sum up everything that's inside that range. Makes sense that it would figure out, hey, you probably want to include that. All right. Pretty cool. Okay, so now let's put this in practice in our budget. And I think you can see what's going. What we want to do here is we want to have some subtotals, right? We probably want to add up all these numbers. So let's go ahead and I'm going to add an extra row in here. I'm going to go insert row. I'm going to type right here. I'm going to say subtotal expenses. Okay, so subtotal expenses. And I want to add up all those numbers inside there. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to use the sum function, right? So let's go ahead and go equals. And then what am I going to do? I'm going to type sum. And then I'm going to start with the open bracket. And then can you guess what we can do? Yes, we can type out D4, but if I just click on that, it just puts it in there automatically for me. There's a nice shortcut that we knew about beforehand that we can apply in this case. Now let's do colon, and then we can just, what's the last value? What's the last cell in this range? Because we want this entire range starting up here, ending right here. We're going to click on D10, right? And then we're going to close that. And so now we've written a nice little function here that tells our spreadsheet, hey, add up or sum up all the values that are between D4 and D10. All right, that looks good. Let's hit enter. And there we go. It's added that all up for us. Okay, cool. Let's do the same thing down here. Let's go subtotal income. Okay, we want to figure out how much income we have. Fingers crossed that we're not going to lose money here. Let me show you, before we could write this out because we know how to write out our function, but now that we've actually learned how to write them out, I'm going to go ahead and tell you another secret. The sum function, because it's such a popular function, because it's so frequently used, almost every spreadsheet that I've ever run across has a shortcut button that will automatically input the sum function for you. And that shortcut button is going to look like the sigma button right here. Do you see this little, I don't know if you remember, but this is the sigma sign, or the sigma letter, the Greek letter sigma. Okay, do you see that? It looks kind of like a crazy capital E. This button right here, if you see this in a spreadsheet, okay, what that is a function button. And if I hover over this, in this case, this is a shortcut that's just going to add a sum function right here. All you need to do to use it is you just need to position your cursor. You just need to select the cell that is adjacent to, okay, right next to a series of numbers. And watch what happens when I click this button. I'll click this button once, and look, it wrote the whole thing. And you're thinking, how did it know that? The spreadsheet's pretty good. Spreadsheets are pretty smart this way. Well, it knew that you wanted the sum function, because in this case, that's how this is set up to do. So just automatically put equals sum. And then the range, it looked at what numbers are closest to the cell that you had selected, and it just pre-selected that entire range, figuring that, oh, you probably don't want to include the word total in there, and it just pre-selected that for you. Isn't that cool? Very, very handy. If you weren't happy, you could always just, cancel that and type it in, manually. And that's why I started by showing it to you manually, because I wanted to make sure that you knew how they were actually constructed. Okay. It's one thing. Shortcuts are great, but you really need to understand what's happening behind them in order to be able to use them effectively. But in this case, this is perfect. So let's say, yeah, I want that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit return. And whoops, I'm not going to hit return. I'm sorry about that. When you use that button, what you need to do is you need to use the accept button. So again, in this case, it's that little blue arrow. It's usually going to be right next to the actual sum function button. And if it's not a blue arrow, it's going to look like something like a green check mark or something like that. You're basically saying, yes, this looks good. I accept what you've automatically selected for me. I'll go accept, and it's figured it out for us automatically. Isn't that cool? All right, that is super, super cool. Okay, phew, I think it's time to take a break. In the next screencast, we're really close to having this done. In the next screencast, we're going to start talking about using our spreadsheet to find solutions, okay? Because remember, we want to put the spreadsheet to work for us, okay? We've built this awesome spreadsheet. Now let's put it to work for us. And that's what we're going to do in the next screencast. So I'll see you then.